I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 18 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. The committee is meeting on its study of challenges of the parliamentary interpretation service in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Clerk, are there any replacements or members in the room? There are no members in the room, but we have one replacer, Mr. Mazer, for Mr. Williamson tonight. Thank you very much. So, in order to participate virtually properly, I'd like to give you a few rules. For those taking part remotely, I would like to take this opportunity to
screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. And also highlight the fact that this was mentioned by Speaker Rota on September 2019, 2020. Les députés et les témoins peuvent s'exprimer.
Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French.
Click on the microphone icon to activate your own mic. When you are done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. Je vous rappelle que toutes les
A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed to the chair.
Please speak slowly and clearly. À moins de circonstances exceptionnelles.
Unless there are exceptional circumstances, the use of headsets with a boom microphone is mandatory for everyone participating remotely.
Please advise the chair. Please note that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure that all members are able to participate fully. Et pour celles et ceux qui participent à la réunion en personne.
For those who are taking part in person, well, I'm told nobody is there in person. So I just wanted to say that it's very important to wear a mask if you are there. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. For the first part of this meeting, we will be welcoming Mr. Yvon Barrière, Regional Executive Vice President, Quebec Region of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So, Mr. Barrière, you will have 7.5 minutes for your presentation, which will be followed by questions by members of the committee, as well as for all members and witnesses. When you have 1 minute left, I will indicate that. And when you see the red carton, that will mean that your time is up, so I'll ask you to conclude your remarks within a few seconds. So, ladies and gentlemen, given that, I would ask Mr. Barrière to take the floor for the next 7.5 minutes, please. Mr. Barrière. Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the Standing Committee on Official Languages, first of all, I wish to thank you for this invitation to testify on the impact of COVID-19 and the government's ability to provide information in both official languages. The Public Service Alliance of Canada represents over 200,000 workers across the country and elsewhere in the world. Our members work, among other areas, in security, in federal departments and agencies, in crown corporations, universities, casinos, community service agencies, Indigenous communities, and airports. In addition to its head office in Ottawa, the PSAC has 23 regional offices. We represent about 50% of federal public servants. The COVID-19 pandemic brought its share of challenges for our members. Overnight, many of them found themselves working from home, no longer seeing one another except virtually. Our members have gone to great lengths to provide emergency services to Canadians in a very short period of time. I'm thinking of, for instance, the implementation of the CERP tool that helped thousands of people, thanks in large part to the hard work of our members. At the outset, it's important to recognize that all workers have the right to speak and to work in the official language of their choice in the federal public service. While this might be true on paper, it's clear that inequity remains between English and French in our institutions. The pandemic has accentuated this. Allow me to go a little further here, but there is systemic discrimination that is well and deeply anchored in the government apparatus of Canada. It's taken for granted that things happen in English first and then in French. You know that in his latest report, Raymond Théberge, the Commissioner of Official Languages, concluded that there are shortcomings in government communications in French in times of crisis, such as during this current COVID-19 pandemic. He stressed the need to modernize the Official Languages Act, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. He stated that a thorough review of the Act must be conducted, otherwise the same problems will continue. The PSAC fully agrees with Commissioner Théberge. We must absolutely modernize the Official Languages Act. The pandemic has made these inequities even more egregious, with most people now working from home and only interacting with their colleagues virtually. Workers have complained that managers often do not send important information to employees in both official languages. I have seen this in the field. The pandemic has made it more difficult for our members to work in French. A glaring example is that Zoom and team meetings are often held in English, and unfortunately, access to simultaneous interpretation services is rather rare. Without in-person meetings to break the ice, language barriers become a barrier to effective communications more than ever. Francophones often feel forced to express themselves in their second language in order not to exclude their colleagues, either because translation is not available or not fast enough. Anglophones, on the other hand, do not feel comfortable speaking French for fear of being judged. There are two important points here. On the one hand, the lack of information provided in both of languages to employees, and on the other, the lack of tools and exchange spaces to facilitate the use of both languages, especially in the context of telework. If we want to create a dynamic, diverse, and bilingual federal public service, we must create an atmosphere where employees are both able and encouraged to work in the language of their choice. Working from home should be the spark that spurs the government to take action and improve bilingualism in the federal public service to enable us to provide better services to the public and ensure that every worker feels comfortable working in the language of his or her choice. It is the federal government's duty to provide the tools necessary to achieve this. The Canadian Public Service should be a choice workplace where bilingualism is encouraged and supported by the employer. We must never forget that Francophones and bilingual people in every province and territory across Canada are not only in Quebec. These people have the right to work in the language of their choice, and the public has the right to receive services in French or in English. It is of utmost importance that federal employees have access to communications and documents in both languages, both for them and for the Canadians receiving services. In a pandemic context, this is a matter of health and safety. Improving bilingualism must absolutely be a priority for the federal government. One of the most tangible examples of the government's inaction on official languages in the public service is the bilingual bonus. Positions that are currently bilingual receive an $800 bonus per year. This amount has not been reviewed since the 90s. We have repeatedly pushed the government to review this policy, but it has always refused to budge. Worse yet, in 2019, the government even proposed eliminating the bilingualism bonus. This is adding insult to injury. But the public servants who receive this bonus are inclined to refuse it because it brings about a harder workload. Bilingualism should be recognized as a superior skill. There are possible solutions to improve the place of French in the public service.
De reconnaître la valeur du travail. We have to increase the bonus for employees, and we have to recognize and compensate employees who work in both languages, orally and in writing. Just as the government has taken action to recognize Indigenous languages, the government as an employer must provide an example and recognize the contribution of staff who use Indigenous languages by giving them a bonus. We also have to offer more language training to encourage government employees, Anglophone and Francophone, to develop their second language. The Treasury Board must also stop subcontracting language training and must concentrate on creating its own training program made up of public servants who can concentrate on the specific needs of the federal public service. The government must also take into account that the COVID-19 pandemic has tremendously affected accessibility to information in both official languages and must try to correct that situation. It must provide information in both languages. The initiative from Ms. Joly is a good initiative, but this must continue and more work is necessary. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much. And we will now go on to a period of questions, 6 minutes from the members. You are the only witness for this part of the meeting, and I would like to give the mic to the Vice Chairman, Mr. Blaney, for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Barrière. Welcome to our committee. I was lucky enough to be a federal civil servant, a public servant in Quebec City, and what you've said is quite striking, and I would say that it's somewhat shocking when you talk about discrimination, systemic discrimination with regard to Francophone public servants. I would like to ask you to give more information about that. And this is really the reality in the civil service. Thank you very much, Blaney. Yes, I know very well that you were a public servant in Quebec City, and I've only heard good things about you. If I have the time, I could give you some examples, but there are many situations with regard to the public service, the federal public service, for example. Often we find that the federal public service is concentrated on English first and foremost, and then minorities. So I think there's a whole process that is the dominant one, and that is not to the advantage of Francophone public servants. And I think this is the case in New Brunswick, Quebec, the national capital, Manitoba. I think about the St. Boniface community, for example, near Winnipeg. So there are many situations where the Francophone public servants feel that they are disadvantaged. And one example, if I may, is the staffing. If you take the time to look at staffing, there are many positions, management positions that are either bilingual or English unilingual, but never French unilingual. And this is a fact for our federal Francophone public servants. And they are often required to speak English so as not to delay work or discussions in order to make themselves understood, and they choose efficiency or effectiveness rather than continuing in their long language. And if I understand you, it means that federal public servants are second-class employees because often management positions are unilingual or bilingual, unilingual English. And I wonder if, Chair, if this testimony should not be included with our study on the use of French in the country. And thank you very much. And I have great consideration and appreciation for the Federal Civil Service. And I learned today that the president of the Treasury Board, Mr. Coutu, had an embolism today, and I hope that he will soon be feeling better. And often I'm confused with him by people because we look alike. But Mr. Barrier, we heard that this imbalance between French and English. Have you felt this as an effect of the pandemic? And do you think that the government has really succeeded in correcting the situation, or if there's just been a little bit too little here and there? Well, first of all, Mr. Blaney, since you mentioned it, my thoughts are with Mr. Coutu, and I think that there are departments that have been very proactive, and I don't want to go too far, but I think there have been many activists who, when there have been bilingual meetings, there have been translation services and interpreter provided, but more often there was not. And with the bilingualism bonus, and often the civil servants provided translation or for the others themselves. And I would also like to mention that Francophones do not have access to the high-level management positions. And I think that at the very least, the high-level position should be bilingual. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank you for your wishes for Mr. Duclos. And he is back home and feeling better, but that reminds us all that we have to be careful and take care of our health, even during especially in the pandemic context. So the next 6 minutes will be for Ms. Latanzio. Ms. Latanzio, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barrier, for being here. So you talked about the Official Languages Commissioner report. I'd like to talk about a survey in 2021 of 11,000 public servants across Canada, both Francophone and Anglophone. In the survey, we can find interesting information about the insecurity with regard to the two languages. This is a challenge, especially for the Francophones, but also for Anglophones, for people coming from Quebec. And there is a need for different and complementary solutions for Anglophones and Francophones for their first and second languages. What do you think about this approach, and what examples can you give about these problems for the two linguistic groups? Yes, I read and reread the conclusions, and it's quite striking. And often our Francophone federal public servants, in order to move files ahead and to be sure that their Anglophone colleagues understand, they speak English. And I think almost 80% of the Anglophones don't really dare to speak in French because they're afraid of being criticized or not being able to express themselves adequately. And there were often problems and situations where these problems led to a slowing down of the work of files. Yes, but what about language insecurity for Anglophones coming from Quebec, for example? There are solutions, and I think we have to promote language training for the Anglophone minority in Quebec, as well as for people in the National Capital Region or in New Brunswick. And we have to stress training during working hours in order to promote bilingualism and to make Anglophone more comfortable in French. I think that the Alliance will soon be undertaking a survey. And what kind of information are you wanting to get from this survey? What kinds of questions are you going to be asking? So what do you want to find out in your survey? Well, you have a very good information, and congratulations. You have very good sources, and indeed, we're going to working with the Federation of Quebec Workers. We're going to send a survey out to our colleagues to find out what the situation is, because before coming here today, we undertook a mini survey, and we worked with Léger, for example, to do the survey. And what we're hoping to do, we're going to look into the problem of French and official languages. Is French respected in their workplaces, in order to have a better idea of what the situation is, and based on the survey, possibly send suggestions to Minister Joly. And so when are you going to send this survey out? In the coming weeks. Would you have any other recommendations that you would add to the report of the Official Languages Commissioner's report?
Well, I would certainly say reform for the Official Languages Act. I also mentioned Indigenous languages being added. But coming back to the two official languages, I think we need to find ways of assuaging that linguistic insecurity some people are experiencing and easing access to translation interpretation. In particular, all documents that federal public servants receive. I would, for example, wish for all French and English documents to be made available at the same time, whether it be documents or emails, for all of that to be done in a professional manner. Often, translations are done through Google Translate. All of these aspects should be improved upon this will be beneficial for employees, managers, and senior officials. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. Thank you, Ms. Latanzio and Mr. Barrière. Mr. Beaulieu now has the floor for the next 6 minutes, please. Go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you, Mr. Barrière, for your testimony. It's shocking for Francophones outside of Quebec. They've spoken about systemic discrimination against Francophones and also mentioned the situation in Quebec. Did I understand that right, what you mentioned? Yes, absolutely. I didn't actually use the expression against Francophones, but there certainly is inequity. It would be interesting for you to go into further detail about Francophones in the Federal Public Service, because generally at the Official Languages Committee, it is Anglophone lobbyist groups that come to represent Quebec. So could you go into further detail on the point of view about Francophones? You worked as a Federal Public Service for a long time. Can you tell us about your difficulties as an employee? Well, like Mr. Blaney, it is true. For a bit longer than Mr. Blaney, for about 25 years, I was a federal public servant. And, well, listen, at the beginning, I was always surprised at directives, at rules that were always provided in English. And there was a saying that we would hear, translation will soon be available. Sometimes it took days, sometimes weeks. And this might confirm your comment on discrimination. I also was part of a workplace or national health and safety committee. So now this will help you understand the introduction to my speech. I was part of a national health and safety committee. And here's what we listened to. We listened to union and employer representatives. And there were 4 representatives of employees. So we listened to the employer side and the employee side, and we discussed health and safety for the employees. And I went around the table, and I realized that there was a coincidence. The 3 union representatives were Francophones from Quebec. 2 were unilingual, and I would include myself. My bilingualism wasn't strong. And there were also the 2 chairs and the representative from the employer side were completely bilingual or were from the National Capital Region or from Quebec, and they had excellent bilingualism. One person was from Winnipeg, and the entire committee was carried out in English and was translated into the other language. I said, can't we speak in French? 11 out of 12 of us speak French. So at every meeting, by default, even the chair, who was a Francophone, even though he spoke very good English, always began the meeting in English. That was just a way of doing things. That was a default. It was what you could call a deep-rooted culture for the meeting to be conducted in English. But there was simultaneous interpretation. Now, to come back to the pandemic, recently I looked into my department's health and safety committee and saw that the meetings there are carried out by video conference in English with no interpretation. So if a Francophone member speaks in French, because the committee has changed since I was on it, the unilingual Anglophone members do not understand what is being said. So people representing Quebec feel obliged to speak in English. You spoke about the bilingualism bonus. Can you speak how that is collected, how it is collected by Federal Public Service? Is the amount sufficient? Well, that's a great question. The $800 amount was first set in the 1990s. We asked repeatedly for increases, In 2019, the federal government suggested removing it completely. They never wanted to budge on increasing it. $800 does not represent the extra workload required. And in the pandemic, often those who receive the $800, hey, can you translate what was just said for me? So there's a double role there. There's a translation role that shouldn't be the case. Many public servants have a French phone line and an English phone line. Many francophones have to have their communications in English more often than not. And when it comes to the correctional service, they speak about caseloads. And when they have the $800 bonus, when they have a caseload of 85 inmates, 17 or 18 of those inmates are Anglophone from Ontario or from the West, and they're imprisoned in Quebec penitentiaries. And this gives those workers a heightened workload, a caseload, because they need to write in the other language to respect official languages requirements. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Now, Mr. Boulris has the floor for the next 6 minutes. The floor is yours. Mr. Beaulieu, we can still hear you. Okay. Mr. Barrière, welcome to the Official Languages Committee. It's a great pleasure for me to speak with you this evening. You have given testimony that is extremely relevant and will be very helpful to us in our study. And I would like to reinforce what my colleagues have said, wishing Minister Duclos a speedy recovery. And it's important for me to say that because we're all colleagues here. And I don't want to be insensitive, because recently when Mr. Duclos came to speak to us, he said, regarding official languages, no compromise should be made. Compromises are unacceptable. And now, when I hear what you're saying, I think there have been compromises. There have perhaps been more compromises during the pandemic. For example, meetings that were not interpreted, or meetings being carried out in English, even though the majority of participants are Francophone. So I'd like to hear you speak about two things. First, regarding the distribution of written documents only in English. Was that done only in English? And then can you talk about subcontracting? Well, when I was preparing, I communicated with representatives from many departments. I asked them all to carry out checks of what could be checked. So, to answer your first question, were our public servants receiving French documents within an acceptable time frame? Well, not always. Still now, we're seeing two ways of departments in the way that they act. We have some departments who say, we're going to finish such and such a study. We are going to review the directives, and we will wait for the translation before we distribute those documents to everyone. And I commend that. But there are some departments that distribute documents first in English, and sometimes a few days later, sometimes a few weeks later, the French documents come out, and sometimes employees are forced to remind their manager that the French has still not been made available. So in the directives, in the rules, English takes priority. But if we want all Canadians to be able to be served in French and English, first our Francophone public servants must be properly informed and must know what the current situation is, what information they can explain to Canadians. It's extremely important in a pandemic and when it comes to health and safety. Now, to know if the translation is always properly done when it's subcontracted, I haven't checked the models, but I can tell you that very frequently. Very often, what is reported to me is that the boss starts a meeting and begins the meeting and says, hello, bonjour. And then that's symbolic. It's a token for them. And then they just move on. Also, we have administrative assistants who are bilingual who will translate certain things in emails, for example. And as I said earlier, that translation is often awkwardly done. Sometimes Google Translate and the like is used, and this can lead to meaning changes and confusion. And that's why it's important to call on real professionals. The pandemic has changed the way everyone works, including federal public servants who have needed to adapt. I think it is extremely regrettable, for example, that people had to pay out of pocket to plug into high-speed internet. The federal government continues to pay for the basic government internet, but the government hasn't increased that. And now I'd like to come back to the bilingualism bonus. I have often seen in institutions where the bilingualism bonus was a percentage, 5, 6, 7% of the wages. But with this bonus not being increased, what message does that send to people about the importance of bilingualism in the public service? Well, I think you answered your own question there. The message that it sends is that the importance is secondary. But our PSAC members strive for good results, but $800 is not always sufficient. It's also possible, Mr. Boulris, that there is a shortage or a lack of Francophone public service servants in the federal public service. I would be very curious to be able to carry out more tests in the future. Maybe if I were to come back to the committee, I could have more information to share with you. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. Thank you, Mr. Boulris. Now, we will move on to the second rounds of questions. And Mr. Dalton has the next 5 minutes, please. Go ahead. Thank you very much. I will be sharing my time with Mr. Godin. And I would like to start by thanking you, Mr. Barrière, for your testimony. It is extremely interesting. I'm an MP from the west of Canada in the Vancouver area. I would like to hear your thoughts on the situation for federal employees more in the west of the country, in Vancouver, in Alberta. What challenges do you observe in the minority situation? Well, thank you, Mr. Dalton. And first of all, Mr. Dalton, thank you for the effort you make to speak French. I admire people who make that effort. And in Vancouver, there are towns and areas, and there are even fights being fought to have Francophone schools in your beautiful province.
Ms. Lalonde doesn't quite agree, but I can tell you that challenge, well, I think in the West mainly, and here, when I'm talking about discrimination, we're talking about a state which is an entitlement. Everything is done in English. If somebody wants to speak French in a meeting and raises a hand, it wouldn't even be considered in the conference or meeting. Because even in Eastern Canada, when a department says, well, I'd like to get a representative on a given file, and we make an announcement, and very often, great coincidence, It's often bilingual employees who get that representative position to be part of a committee, a group, a task force, or whatever to try to improve certain practices. So quite often, we know that those who are francophone, have a French mother tongue, also speak English, and that's done in the West too. Everything's done in English. People don't have an opportunity to practice unless they're in a national committee, which sometimes exchange with people from Quebec or New Brunswick or the National Capital Region. Do you think there are enough people who speak both languages in those regions in order to work and serve the people in French? Well, if there are enough people throughout the West or across Canada, I'm talking more about the West. I know more about this area because I'm an MP, the only representative west of Manitoba here. Well, I did a little exercise and did some checking. I'll answer with a memo that I was sent, Mr. Dalton. Imagine if this was sent to the East or to the West. It's dated December 23rd, 2020. I'll read it so I don't make a mistake. And it really surprised me to see this memo. Let me see here. I'm looking for it. This is a sentence from this communication from December 23rd, 2020. It says, "Could you please provide the following information to facilitate initial contact with the departmental payroll system? There is a limited number of people in that area that speak French, and that can delay meetings taking place." If that's true in Eastern Canada, Mr. Dalton, it's definitely true in your area. It's even worse. I don't like the word worse, but it's even worse. Okay, Mr. Godin now. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have very little time, but I'd like to take a few seconds to salute Jean-Yves Duclos, my colleague. Beyond partisanship, there are human beings that serve our parliament, and he's my colleague from the Quebec City region. He's a gentleman, and I have some good thoughts for him, and I wish him speedy recovery. Mr. Barrière, you talked about systemic discrimination. That's quite a heavy expression, but that's probably reality. You talked about the bilingual bonus. What I've noted is doesn't work. It hasn't been increased in decades. Could we look at it in another way and require from the officials that they have an obligation to produce results, to cut their salary or their bonuses or their their remuneration in some way if they don't, spending money. Yeah, you said this at the beginning. Somebody says hello, bonjour, bienvenue in French at the beginning of a meeting and then switches to English, and they just check that box. They don't speak French anymore. They skip it. So giving bonuses, isn't that a way of skipping the importance of the Francophone public service? Take the problem the other way and give incentives to senior officials to have obligations in this area. Well, I agree with you that there should be an obligation to produce results in this area. While you were talking, I was thinking about a certain time when there was a staffing system whereby it was imperative or non-imperative. It was far less discriminatory because a unilingual Francophone could apply for a job and be told, you have the best skills. If you want the job, we have to train you. We give you 1 year to become perfectly bilingual and meet the bilingual requirement for BBB or CCC. That was one way to do things. But if we want our people to be bilingual and bring about new positions, and maybe we should increase this from 800 to something that's a true incentive for all those who want to become bilingual, be they Francophone or Anglophone. They'll then improve and become bilingual. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. That's all the time we have, but I want to inform members that we're in the second round, but there will not be a third round for two parties, because later we have to have time to adopt the budget for the next study we're undertaking. So for the time being, I'll give the floor for the next 5 minutes to Ms. Martinez Ferrada. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being with us tonight, Mr. Barrière. And I, too, would like to salute my colleague, Mr. Duclos, and wish him a speedy recovery, and send my best wishes to his family, and I hope we'll see him again very soon, maybe even before this committee. First of all, very quickly, I wanted to make a comment about the question of systemic discrimination. I would say we have to talk about organizational culture, where different reflexes have to be developed. They're not there right now when it comes to French and English. I think the notion of systemic discrimination leads to a lot of questions, and I'm looking at my chairman here. I'd like to make a quick comment about that. It makes me quite uncomfortable to hear it expressed that way. Mr. Barrière, many unions, including the PIPS and the CAPE and the president of your organization, are asking for better training in the second official language. You talked about that, but I'd like to get back to that issue, because I'm convinced that the promotion of linguistic duality in the public service is important, and I'd like to know if you... I think this requires a new framework for training in the second official languages. Well, Ms. Ferrada, first of all, I didn't want to offend you or anyone else when using this expression, which I know is very concerning, very heavy. That word, systemic, is used a lot lately, but I did want to draw a parallel. It'll never be as significant as systemic racism, but you're right when you talk about organizational culture. Would it be in our interest to get the means and store the means to favor bilingualism? Well, we completely agree with that. We have to have the means to achieve this in keeping with our ambitions. We want a bilingual public service, so all that requires training, education, and raising awareness among everyone to be able to provide better service to Canadian citizens. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. So linguistic reform, as announced by the minister last week, contains many proposals, as you know. You listed a few of them. A new language training framework, a review of evaluation criteria, especially for supervisory positions. So if the senior public service is bilingual, truly bilingual, that will trickle down into organizations. The qualification criteria in official languages have to be reviewed too, and you talked about that. Do you agree that these measures will strengthen the current system? We should work on this question of a reflex, have the reflex of promoting both languages. Well, definitely. It's always is a matter of giving an example, serving as a role model. I can't disagree with what you're saying. But right now, given the Official Languages Act, quite often it's just a matter of statistics that's used. Such and such a department in such a region must have a minimum of so many bilingual employees. So it's difficult to sometimes to fit that mold. But to give you an example of what I experienced in my department, I was at Correctional Services, and it always surprised me that we never managed to find an electrician or a plumber for Port-Cartier. near Sept-Îles. Why couldn't we find one? Well, because in the staffing framework, we needed bilingual employees in response to the Official Languages Act. But nobody in that area near Sept-Îles is bilingual for that kind of job. But we must help senior management become bilingual and thus improve bilingualism at all levels. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for your interventions. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Beaulieu for 2.5 minutes, please. Mr. Beaulieu. Fine. Earlier, we talked about a survey. On the Anglophone side, there was also insecurity, apparently. You said that some are insecure when they speak French. Do you think that there are Anglophone public servants who don't feel comfortable speaking English? You're referring to Francophone public servants? Yes, of course. Yes, there are some who are insecure. Why? Well, not because they have lack of opportunity, because they often have the opportunity to speak English, but maybe lack of training. When we're talking about technical subjects, there might be the technical aspect. They may have some kind of handicap and they are pressured to be high performance. We meet this with senior management. People don't want to look bad in front of management or senior management because that'll come up in their performance review. They might prevent them from getting an acting position or a senior position. So yes, there's insecurity of that kind in Francophones and Anglophones, and I must say that this is true throughout Canada. Well, what I have trouble understanding is, are there Anglophones who are not comfortable speaking English, and in what proportion? I think they're more comfortable speaking English, definitely. Quite often they want to speak English, but every time they have an opportunity in a bilingual group where there are Francophones and Anglophones, they also like to see simultaneous interpretation. Well, it might be a difficult question, but working in the language of one's choice, is that effective? Doesn't there have to be a common language in a workplace? What happens when someone wants to speak French and the other person wants to speak English? Well, that's a whole philosophical question, and of course, it's difficult. It's a question of communication and sound communication and respect in a situation like that. I see that the red card is saving my bacon here. No, it's not like soccer. You won't be expelled from the game. Stay with us, because the last question will come from Mr. Boulris for 2.5 minutes, please. Go ahead, Mr. Boulris. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barrière, I'd like to get back to something you said earlier, which titillated me. You said, essentially, there might be a problem with the lack of Francophone public servants in the federal public service. And I was wondering, according to your experience, what explains the lack of a critical mass in some regions, perhaps more than others? Lack of Francophones or bilingual people, according to your experience in the last few years. What explains that?
Thank you very much. A very good question. I think it's with regard to hiring. There are staffing needs that are defined, and sometimes there are not the right candidates, or sometimes there are delays in providing services in French. And in the context of trying to communicate with the Treasury Board and Ms. Joly, I don't know what the statistics are right now, but it might be fairly easy to find out what percentage of francophones in Canada have access to francophone services. But certainly, we feel that there is a lack of services to francophone communities. Very quickly, but I see that I saw the yellow card. I think it's very important to say that often when there's an urgent situation, an emergency, that's a crisis, it's always an excuse, or it's often an excuse to not respect francophone rights. Do you think that the pandemic means that you just have to ignore francophone needs? No, not at all. With the number of francophones and even though we may be a minority, I think that it's even more important in a pandemic context to be able to provide information in both languages as quickly as possible for civil servants and therefore indirectly to Canadians. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Boulris. Thank you, Mr. Barrière. On behalf of all the members of the committee and personally, I would like to thank you for your participation, for your contribution to this study that we're undertaking. I would like to point out that you are the regional executive vice president of the Quebec region of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. I thank you, and we are going to suspend briefly to go on to the next witnesses. Again, thank you very much. We are resuming. Today, the committee is meeting on a study, challenges of the parliamentary interpretation services in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses. Avant de prendre la parole, attendez que je vous nomme. Lorsque vous êtes prêt pour parler, cliquez sur l'icône du micro pour...
Je vous rappelle que toutes les observations.
I remind you that everything you said should be addressed to the chair. L'interprétation fonctionne comme dans une réunion habituelle. Vous avez le choix en bas de la...
Floor, English or French. Lorsque vous parlez, exprimez-vous lentement et...
When you speak, please speak clearly. When you are not...
Voilà, donc je voudrais souhaiter la plus cordiale bienvenue.
So, welcome to our witnesses for this second part of the meeting. You have an opening presentation for 7 minutes, followed by questions from the members of the committee. And before greeting you officially, Mr. Beaulieu has a point of order. There seems to be a problem with. There seems to be a bit of a problem with the translation. I just hear a bit. So I'm going to come back.
Will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Est-ce que ça va, Monsieur Beaulieu?
Is that okay, Mr. Beaulieu? Yes, it's working. So, to greet our witnesses, we have Ms. Pamela Ongtin. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And then you are ADM for Communications and Policy. We also have Ms. Bombardier, ADM for Health and Food. And once again, I would say to the members who are going to share their time that the last 5 minutes will be removed so that we can move on to our budget. So, Ms. Thin, Ms. Bombardier, when you only have 1 minute left, I'll raise the yellow card and then the red card when you don't have any more time left. So, I don't know who is going to begin, so you have the floor. Ms. Thin, go ahead, you have 7.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me to appear before the committee today. I appreciate this opportunity to describe how Health Canada has been meeting the requirements of the Official Languages Act as we keep Canadians informed as we fight the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Pamela Ongtin. You pronounced it correctly. It's very appreciated. I am the Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of the Communications and Public Affairs Branch, which provides services to both Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada. Accompanying me today is Manon Bombardier, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of Health Canada's Health Products and Food Branch. Our branches play an important part in the government's overall response to the COVID-19 outbreak in Canada. I want to begin by saying that communicating with Canadians in the official language of their choice is more than just a legal or policy requirement. It is a core communications practice. During a crisis, clear, effective communication takes on even greater importance because being understood can put the health and safety of Canadians at risk. We take this responsibility seriously, and it shapes how we do business every day. The expectations regarding the use of official languages in government communications are quite clear. Under the Official Languages Act, federal institutions are required to communicate and offer services to the public in both official languages. The Government of Canada's policy and communications and federal identity provides further guidance. It requires that government departments provide information in both official languages in accordance with the Act and that they consider the needs of official language minority communities in Canada in their communications. We in the health portfolio strive to meet these requirements in all our communications. For example, every news release, statement, or written product we issue is released in both English and French at the same time. Information published on our website is also posted simultaneously in both English and French. During the pandemic, we are also making key information about COVID-19 and the government's efforts to reduce the spread of the disease available in many other languages, including several indigenous languages. When we host media availabilities and technical briefings, there are always experts available from Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada to speak in both official languages. Finally, within the department and the agency, communication with employees takes place in both official languages, and employees are encouraged to work in the language of their choice. Employees and managers are assessed at mid-year and year-end on performance objectives related to language requirements in their performance agreement. For example, these are standard communication practices in the Government of Canada, which we endeavour to follow at all times. The pandemic has not changed this. However, this unprecedented crisis has presented some additional challenges. We always respect official languages. Our top priority is protecting the health and safety of Canadians. In the current context, we do everything possible to control the spread of COVID-19. That includes facilitating access to products needed to slow the spread of the disease. With the onset of the pandemic in March 2020, there was unprecedented demand for products to limit the spread of COVID-19, including hand sanitizers and disinfectants, household and workplace cleaners, and hand and body soaps. The labels are a key source of information for Canadians about how to use these products. Every product sold in Canada requires a bilingual label. At the beginning of the pandemic, demand had increased exponentially. It was often very difficult to find many of these products on store shelves or through online retailers. Foreign suppliers of hand sanitizers and hard surface disinfectants indicated that they were producing these products with a global English-only label, and they would ship only to countries accepting English-only labeling. Due to the unprecedented demand and to ensure that Canadians would continue to have access to these products to prevent the spread of COVID-19, Health Canada implemented interim policies in March and April 2020 to facilitate access on a temporary and emergency basis to certain products labeled in only one official language. Hand sanitizers manufactured in Canada with unilingual labels could only be sold in unilingual regions based on the language of that region. Health Canada closely monitored the supply of hand sanitizers and disinfectants. As supply began to stabilize, a return to bilingual labeling was proactively initiated on May 19, 2020, with a transition period permitted until June 8, 2020 for existing products. Health Canada, that was for existing products. Health Canada required importers to provide information at point of sale. For example, information on a website or bilingual signs. We also adopted measures to reply to the high demand for health products necessary to slow the spread of COVID. In addition, the interim measures for products manufactured in Canada supported the tremendous mobilization of the Canadian business community to support the fight against COVID-19. Across the country, we witnessed a remarkable collaboration from companies and industries that stepped up and offered their support, expertise, and resources to address critical supply needs. In conclusion, the pandemic has changed so much for Canadians over the past year. However, it has not changed our commitment to communicating and serving Canadians in the official language of their choice. Despite Despite the exceptional circumstances, I'm confident that the health portfolio continues to meet its obligations under the Official Languages Act during this prolonged crisis. We are now happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. So, over to you, Chair.
Vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Now we will begin a 6-minute question period. The first questions will be asked by Mr. Blaney. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Deputy Minister of Health, to our committee. Ms. Deputy Minister, I would like to congratulate you for your management of the pandemic, which was very flexible, which we saw in my writing regarding manufacturing of equipment for the vaccines, and also the gin manufacturers that adapted and started to manufacture hand sanitizer products. It was very flexible. When it comes to official languages, I must say, Ms. Deputy Minister, that your remarks disappointed me. I was hoping for more transparency. The Commissioner of Official Languages was more critical. He said, in a crisis situation, it is all the more important that the federal government ensure access for all Canadians to essential information in the language of the Canadian's choice, no matter where in the country. Initial communications on health information were often sent out only in English, and you said it in your own remarks, this is often a matter of safety, languages are. We have heard from witnesses that in a crisis, bilingualism and official languages take a back seat. Can you talk about communication in this crisis and measures that could be taken to rectify the situation for future crises? Excuse me, before we hear the answer, point of order, Mr. Chair. It seems there is a technical problem for people calling in on the phone lines, trying to listen to our discussions. They haven't had access since we came back from the break between the two panels. I'm sorry, Mr. Blaney, and pardon me, Ms. Angthin. I'm very sorry. I just wanted to call your attention to that. Thank you very much, Ms. Lalonde. I will check with the clerk to make sure that everyone and the technical team as well is able to access the deliberations. And Mr. Blaney, don't worry, I stopped your time for the time that it takes to solve this problem. Well, I would like to rephrase my question, actually, to the witness. Can you tell us how Health Canada is drawing lessons from what you've learned in managing official languages during this crisis so as not to repeat the same mistakes in an upcoming pandemic, even though we're hoping there will be no upcoming pandemic?
Excusez, attends.
I'm stopping the time again, and I'm waiting to hear from the clerk to see if the problem has been fixed or not. In fact, I will need to check on everything before we proceed. So it will be just a moment, please, Mr. Dubourg and committee members. Thank you. Well, in that case, let us suspend for a few moments until the problem has been solved. So we will be starting the sitting again. Mr. Blaney, you are at 1.5 minutes of your 6 minutes. You've already asked your question. So now I would ask one of our two witnesses to respond. Perhaps Ms. Aung Tin. Go ahead with your response, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will begin, and afterwards I will give the floor to my colleague. Pardon me, I'm just going to turn off interpretation. So communication in both languages is always a priority for Health Canada. At the beginning of COVID-19, it certainly was a new situation for everyone, and it certainly was a challenge to respond to all production demands. Nevertheless, we made efforts to increase our capacity to ensure that we could continue to communicate in both official languages at all times. So we increased our capacity by adding translation services internally within the department. We also sent out requests for various other translation services for increased demand. And we continue to distribute all information to the public in both official languages. I would like to note that at all times when we publish documents, whether it be in communiques, documents, or online to the public, it is always in both official languages, and it is always sent out at the same time. I will now give the floor to Manon.
Merci.
Thank you, Pam. Can you hear me properly? Yes. Yes, go ahead, Ms. Bombardier. Okay. As a regulatory agency for health products, critical products, to help combat COVID-19, Health Canada has to communicate regularly with industry that is regulated to share the flexibility that we put in place quickly to accelerate access to critical health products. We also have to communicate with consumers, especially if there are products that present a problem or risks for health. That has to be communicated to consumers quickly. We do that through our website, and health professionals, too, who administer health products or who work in hospitals or long-term care facilities, so that they can have the information necessary to protect themselves and their patients. In all cases, the information is available on our website. It's done in both official languages. We also share information by email, be it for industry that we regulate about our new policies. We do that bilingually. So I can assure you that our role as a regulator is in a bilingual environment, and we take that seriously, and we deliver this according to the Official Language Act requirements. Yes, thank you. Well, look, I'm aware that you do want to offer services in both official languages to consumers and industry, but our study is the pandemic. Your public was the Canadian public that was exposed to a risk. It is still exposed to a risk. We're at the end of the second wave. We hope we won't get a third one. But what's critical is the responsibility for health information. It's often only in English. And what I'm proposing is to bring about solutions for a situation where something similar happens, to learn from our mistakes, things that have been reported by the Commissioner for Official Languages. You know that in a crisis, and you recognize this, we go back to what's important and what's close to our hearts, our mother tongue. But if we neglect the mother tongue of other citizens, we're threatening their health and safety. And that's what we heard from the Commissioner. And we'd like to avoid having this situation occur again and have Francophone citizens end up being second-class citizens in this country. If you have a response in 15 seconds, please go ahead. Yes, if I may answer. The head administrator for public health, Dr. Tam makes her speeches in English, but Dr. New is also part of this. He's the associate to Dr. Tam, and he does it in French. So messages are distributed in the two official languages, maybe not by the same person, but by two people responsible for public health in Canada in both official languages, so that all Canadians can be informed about any news about the pandemic. Thank you, Ms. Bombardier. So for the next 6 minutes, we'll hear Mr. Arsenault. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've noted that starting with the first question by Mr. Blaney to the end, he had 12 minutes, so I'd like as much time, please. Now, having said that, Ms. Ong Thin, you said something at the beginning. I'm from a province that's outside Quebec, but francophone. You said, for us, communicating in both official languages is an essential practice, not just a legal one. So, to my mind, that's proactive. You don't wait to be slapped on the wrist and told about your linguistic obligations before you do something. However, nevertheless, to follow up on Mr. Blaney, the Commissioner of Official Languages did point the finger at Health Canada, but its capacity to communicate in both languages from the start of the pandemic. He said that Health Canada did correct the situation, and he seemed satisfied. Now, having said that, what happened? Why is it that basic products, such as those we needed, only had labeling in one language? I know you mentioned disinfectants, antiseptics, household cleaners, soap. How come basic products like that couldn't be obtained from our usual suppliers who have bilingual labels? Maybe this question's for Ms. Bombardier. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for the question. Perhaps I need to give you a little more context. As my colleague mentioned, at the beginning of the crisis, there was extraordinary demand for those products, particularly for hand disinfectants, antiseptics. The demand compared to 2019 for the same period in March was 7 times higher. In May and June, it was 11 times higher. So I'm sure you noticed on the shelves of stores and supermarkets, there were no antiseptics left. There was very little hand sanitizer left. So at the same time, we had foreign exporters who wanted to send their products to Canada and refused to export them with bilingual labels because they didn't have the capacity to do it at that time. At the same time, we had small Canadian businesses, distilleries and brasseries, breweries, who changed their mandate temporarily to help the cause. Most of them are very small that distribute locally only in their neighborhood. So on a domestic level, we allowed those small businesses to distribute products in the official language of their region. So if they were in Saint-Jean-Port-Joli, they could distribute in French with French labeling. And if it was a bilingual region, they had to be bilingual. But if it was in a unilingual Anglophone region, they could do that in English only on their labeling. Well, if I understand correctly, Ms. Bombardier, the usual suppliers with whom we deal outside the pandemic continued to send them their products with the bilingual labels at the usual rate, but because of the extraordinary demand, we had to go elsewhere? Yes, that's exactly right. It was demand. The demand was extraordinary. It was sometimes 11 times higher than normal. There was no sufficient capacity in Canada to produce enough such products to meet the demand and protect health professionals in the front lines who had to provide treatment and help patients in hospitals and in long-term care facilities. We had to make sure that those products were accessible. So remind me how this was fixed. Is it because demand went down or because we started to translate our own labels or refer to the website? Well, no, Health Canada closely follows supply and demand. It did so for antiseptics at the beginning of the pandemic in March. We looked at supply and demand on the market, and we saw that the supplies, especially with foreign imports, were becoming more and more sufficient to meet the demand of our market. And so in May, we withdrew this policy that allowed certain companies to provide products with unilingual labeling. In May, we allowed Canadian companies that had French labels. How can I put this? We allowed them to finish off their stock. They had 1 month of transition, but as of June 8, all Canadian companies and foreign exporters had to provide their labels in both languages. I have 1 minute left. Ms. Bombardier, I believe it's for you. This experience that we went through, how has it prepared us to face the music if this ever happens again and our demand shoots up 11 times higher for basic products such as antiseptics or sanitizers or what have you? What are we going to do? What are you doing to prepare for that possibility? Well, many factors are taken into account in decision-making when we develop a policy like this. It's not taken lightly. We were watching this supply and demand very closely. We had foreign exporters who were interested, who had the capacity to send us products. We had Canadian distributors that were limited and were regional or local. So it's all those factors that led us to make that policy decision. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are your 6 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Bombardier. So now we'll go on to Mr. Beaulieu for the next 6 minutes, please. Go ahead. In the solution on labeling of these public health products, what's also done quite often is if companies receive a product with an English label only, they translate it and they add a label. That could have been one solution. Well, what we did, thank you for the question, but as of June 8th, for foreign importers, they could have a unilingual label, French or English, but they had to provide something at the point of sale. They had to provide a website address with bilingual information, and that information had to be easily accessible for consumers at this point of sale, either through a label stuck to the bottle, for instance, or a sign or a panel at the point of sale that provided the website where bilingual information could be obtained. We gave them that flexibility in order to make sure that Canadians had information in both languages. Okay, but that forces somebody who doesn't have an internet connection or a computer to try and find it. That makes it difficult. I'm thinking, for instance, of a Canadian company. Canadian Tire, let's say, receives these products. It's not that complicated to translate a label and stick a label in French on the bottle. That's one possible solution. Yes, that was possible, but we were not prescriptive in our approach. We gave them a lot of flexibility, be it producers or distributors. They could have done it as well, but for foreign importers, the minimum was to have a website with the information available and to allow the consumer or the buyer at the point of sale to have access to that information. Well, one example. There are many people who contacted us, citizens who got unilingual alert messages in Francophone regions. I don't know if you were aware of that. And one specific case that was brought to my attention, and I made a complaint to the Commissioner of Official Languages about this, it was the Canada Crisis Service. There was no SMS support. It said not available in French. That happened for 2 weeks. And on its Facebook page, all the visuals are in English only. There's a little bit of text in French, but the visuals are only in English. And that's funded maybe not by you directly, but it is funded by the Canada Public Health Agency, the Canada Mental Health organization of some sort. I don't know if you could intervene in that to make sure that it's in French too. Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my opening remarks, we always issue our information in both official languages at the same time. When it comes to our partners, it's a little more difficult to force partners to produce that information in both languages. If it's the case of a partner that has some link with us but did not issue the information in both official languages, we could discuss that with them, but we can't necessarily impose the same rules. But on our website, they say they have two funders, you and Mental Health Canada. So, to my mind, it's not too much to ask to provide service in French, too. I'd also like to know, because you're repeating that everything is in French and English simultaneously and all that, but the Commissioner of Official Languages and others before me have noted deficiencies. Earlier, there was the Public Service Alliance of Canada. In Quebec, they said that it was very difficult to operate in French, to work in French. Unless you're really an exception, there must be challenges to provide services in French. Okay, thank you for the question.
With regard to internal communications, it's my branch that organizes information sessions and internal communications with and for employees in conjunction with our managers. We always do so. We always ask speakers to use both languages. And so there's always a percentage that's in English and a percentage in French. And we also have interpretation in order to respect official languages. All documents, if I may, very quickly. So all your video conferences, I'm sorry, Mr. Beaulieu. We've gone past the 6 minutes, so I have to stop you there. So we'll now go to Mr. Boulris, 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Boulris. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to Ms. Ontin and Ms. Bombardier for being with us, even though we're a bit late. We heard Mr. Barrière from the Public Service Alliance of Canada saying that there were problems with bilingualism with regard to French, but it depended on which departments. There were some that are better, some that are not as good. I hope you'll be some of the better ones. We'll see what the Commissioner for Official Languages says. But I would like to come back to the labeling. You can probably expect a lot of questions about bilingual labeling. And of course, we all want to respect official languages, except when there's a technical problem or there's a crisis or there's an emergency. And in this emergency, there were exceptions made, and we talked about disinfectants and and personal protection equipment. What do you intend to do to avoid that the same thing happens every time there's an emergency, that French is the loser? Thank you very much again for your question. So I can assure you that we don't think that French is second best. We even in an emergency situation, the emphasis is to provide the products that are needed, and of course the prices went up quickly with regard to producing these products and with regard to buying them. So I can assure you that we were concentrated on ensuring that the frontline workers would be protected. So we took into account the demand and the supply. We monitored it closely, and we adjusted our policies as the situation changed. And we never settled for just unilingual communication. Starting on 8 June, everything was available in both languages, whether for disinfectants or hand sanitizers or other products. Yes, but there another question was, what are you going to do to avoid this same problem in the future? And you said earlier, Ms. Bombardier, that you allowed distribution of products based on the language of the region. And I'd like to know, what is the official language of New Brunswick? It's the Treasury Board that has a policy for a number of years with regard to bilingual regions. There are regions that are recognized as mainly Francophone, others that are mainly Anglophone, and there are regions that are recognized as bilingual. So we use the Treasury Board classification to ensure that in Francophone unilingual areas, then the products could be labeled in French only, and the same thing in Anglophone areas. In most cases, I can assure you that most businesses like distilleries who quickly reacted to provide crisis products were unilingual, but we did everything we could to be bilingual. So I agree that you had to meet the needs of frontline workers. You said earlier that when you work with partners and private enterprises, you can't necessarily apply the same rules. Why, when you are tendering contracts, in the terms of the contract, why can you not insist on respect for official languages? But you say that no, we can't do that. But surely, when you give a contract out, you can put in the conditions you want. Thank you very much. And I was talking about partners that aren't necessarily businesses, but rather nonprofit organizations. It depends on the type of contract and the type of partner. And so we could add specific conditions, but it really depends on the situation that we're faced with. I would encourage you to do it seriously, to respect official languages. Maybe a quick last question. Health Canada sent out alert messages only in English. It's about the same problem. How can you explain that? That's very problematical. Yes, we were talking about COVID alerts. There was an error on the part of one of our providers, suppliers, who was sending out English messages to Francophone clients. And when we discovered the error, we spoke to the supplier, who sent a follow-up message to explain what had happened and to ensure that that the mistake would not be repeated. Thank you very much. So we're now going on to a last last round for 5 minutes, divided between Mr. Williamson and Mr. Mazier. Mr. Williamson isn't here, so it's Mr. Godin, and then my colleague. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I am going to share my time with my colleague, Mr. Dalton. Chairman, just a very short question. I'm curious. Ms. Huntin, you are ADM ad interim, and Ms. Bombardier, you are ADM ad interim as well. How long have you been in your position, your current position? Thank you very much for the question. I've been ad interim ADM since September. And Ms. Bombardier? The same. I started in September. When will you be appointed officially? Good question. We can't answer, unfortunately. I hope it'll be soon. So I heard Ms. Huntin in her opening remarks mention that you were facilitating access to products to prevent the spread of the COVID. I think that's very good. But if people do not have instructions in the language they use in order to protect their health, then that is a risk for their health. So if you're wanting to protect people, you have to provide them protection, their instructions in the language they use. How did it take 3 months to provide for labeling in both official languages? And as we often say in other places, COVID-19 is everywhere. And how can it be true that it took 3 months for Health Canada to react? I don't accept your explanation that it was an emergency and it took time to find solutions. 3 months. Photocopies, 8.5 by 11 in black and white at the store. It would have been very easy to do. I think it was negligent on your part. And did you, too, take part in the decision to allow that for 3 months? Thank you very much for the question. With regard to the labeling and the branch, I was part of the decision, and it was a decision that took into many factors, including supply and demand, and foreign suppliers that could provide large volumes of products, and at a time when COVID was growing so fast, and we needed to protect the health of Canadians. So yes, it took 3 months, but something that is very important to remember is that at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a number of products, disinfectants and hand sanitizers that were authorized, but we didn't have the capacity to produce enough. So that is why we had to increase. I'm sorry. Thank you for your reply. Would you do the same thing in a future pandemic? That would depend on the circumstances of the pandemic. We would take into account the factors and also the need to provide information in both official languages. In this particular case, the situation was a crisis, and the health of Canadians was number one. And so we took decisions based on all the factors. I'm sorry for interrupting you. We don't have much time. I'm going to give the rest of my time to my colleague, Mr. Dalton. You have a minute and a half. I was a bit disappointed and surprised by what you said, as has just been pointed out by my colleague, and you said that the official language chosen by Canadians is not just an obligation, it's a practice in your communications. And you said that federal agencies must communicate with the public in both official languages. And he also said, for example, every time we publish a communiqué or a statement, we provide both English and French at the same time. But that isn't what we saw in reality. That wasn't reality in Vancouver. And I know that the French community in British Columbia was in a difficult situation. There are many immigrants who only spoke French, for example. And it was very frustrating for them, because they had to count on the province for communication and for information. And there were provincial ministers who were bilingual, and so this was a failing on the part of Health Canada. I'm sorry, if you can answer very quickly in 15 seconds. Thank you very much, Chair. So I've noted your comments, and when I say that we communicate in both languages throughout Canada, it means all of Canada, not just the National Capital Region. Thank you very much.
Terry DeGreed, Mr. DeGreed, maybe he's going to share his time with Mrs. Lalonde. So Terry, Mr. DeGreed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will share my time. Thank you to our witnesses. MP Mazier and I are from Manitoba, and Manitoba has a very significant Francophone community in St. Boniface, of course, but also in southern Manitoba, and I believe a few French communities in Mr. Mazier's district. French seniors, residents, 100% Francophone communities, entirely French-speaking, and I certainly got the sense during the pandemic that these communities felt very underserved. The Manitoba briefings, provincial briefings, were 100% in English. Even Radio Canada asked questions in English. I wonder if you could comment on Health Canada's service to the region, how you felt you did in this pandemic, and of course, I'm very interested in the next health crisis and how you might improve service.
Thank you for the question. I will respond in English. I feel that we performed very well as far as official languages go. We also have press conferences that we hold and we offer in both official languages our spokespeople. We offer our questions to be responded in English and French depending on the language that is posed. But we also offer simultaneous translation for those who may not be speak the language that is being responded. So media in French and English can ask questions in the language of their choice and are responded to in that language.
Marie-France.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I represent Orleans. First of all, thank you to both of you. Thank you for the work done. You have brought up some points that are a little new for me. So perhaps I would like to hear you speak in particular about one thing you mentioned. In regions that are designated as unilingual, English labeling was accepted. And as my colleague mentioned, everywhere in the country, there are Francophones who find that the percentage is not high enough. I would like to hear you speak not only to how much you've learned regarding health and safety and what we're discussing today, but also how you plan to prepare for the future. And for both witnesses, I would really like to hear you speak to that because it's concerning when we think about the future. Can you talk about the rules that you followed for distribution to unilingual regions where there probably was a proportion of Francophones? That is an issue that was raised in Orleans and here at the committee. Thank you, and thank you for the question. The Treasury Board policy on recognizing certain regions as Francophone or Anglophone is such that it's not that there are no people with the opposite mother tongue, but the majority of people in that region speak the recognized language. So yes, in those regions, for the 3 initial months of the pandemic, we made it permissible for businesses in those areas to communicate and to provide unilingual labeling, either in French or in English. But it was always recommended to have bilingual labeling. And we're talking about a minority of products here. There were over 5,000 hand sanitizers that we dealt with since the beginning of the pandemic. And we're talking about the minority here. Thank you very much, Ms. Bombardier. And what did you understand from that experience? What did you learn? And how will you better prepare if ever there were another pandemic? What are the lessons that you learned, and what are your takeaways? There are a number of factors in policy decision-making. We take things seriously, including our official languages responsibilities. We respect those responsibilities, and we ensure that we put the measures in place so that Canadians have the information to protect their health. Thank you, Ms. Bombardier, and thank you, Ms. Lalonde. Now, for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. I'd like to continue with what I was saying earlier. I would like to ensure that for all of your meetings, your video conferences, and so forth, do you have interpretation for that, and are the meetings carried out bilingually? I mentioned official meetings at the department. So to come back to the question, we often organize meetings for all employees and speeches for our executives. And we also organize communiques that are distributed to all employees. And in those cases, we always ensure that documents are available in both official languages and that meetings are carried out in both languages and that speaking notes are carried out in a certain percent in French and a certain percentage in English, and that translation is also provided to employees. I just want to clarify. So you say that for all meetings, all documents are always in both languages, are available in both languages. I am referring to official documents that are sent to all employees. But when we're talking about official working meetings and internal documents between employees, are those bilingual? For internal meetings, when it comes to managers or working groups, we always encourage employees to speak in the language of their choice. And we inform employees that communiques are available internally as soon as possible in both languages. And we encourage them to speak in the language of their choice. I raised my hand, but it was by mistake. I have one last question. At present, when it comes to labeling, have you made it mandatory for it to be bilingual, or are there certain conditions? Thank you for the question. For Canadian manufacturers, labeling must absolutely be bilingual, and we carry out checks to ensure it. But for importers, for the moment, they are still permitted to have unilingual labels as long as information is available on the at the place of purchase. Thank you. Mr. Boulris now has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We are at the Official Languages Committee, and as you've understood, our concern is for the Official Languages Act to be respected at all times. I would like to perhaps touch on a different subject. As you will remember, Ms. Joyce Echaquan died in tragic circumstances in the Joliette Hospital. It seemed there were no interpreters available at that time, although apparently an interpreter was supposed to be available. I know this is not at all under your purview, but will there be a particular efforts by your department, given all of that, to help communities that find it a bit harder to communicate and that are at risk because of, for example, a housing crisis or other issues in those communities? Have you made efforts for Indigenous languages in the past months? Thank you for the question. Yes, we do make many efforts regarding Indigenous languages as well. We do send out communiques in Indigenous languages, not only for written documents, but also videos and in other media as well. We also send out information on channels that are managed by Indigenous communities. There is also a Google Drive with various information in various languages as well, not only French and English. And this is on an array of public health information. I think this is available in 23 languages, if I'm not mistaken, including Indigenous languages. So leaders from these communities can access it and distribute those documents and that information in their communities in their mother tongue, even if it isn't English or French. Thank you very much for your answer. In conclusion, I would just like to say that in my world, Google Drive is the same in French as in English, since you were wondering. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Boulris. That's all the time that we have with you. And on behalf of committee members, I would like to thank you, first for having accepted our invitation and to participate in this study. And thank you for your testimony this evening. And so you are from the Department of Health. And with us this evening, we had Ms. Pamela Aung-Tin. She's Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of Communications and Public Affairs. And Ms. Manon Bombardier, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of the Health Products and Food Branch. Thank you both, and I hope you have an excellent evening. Committee members will stay on with me for another 10 minutes or so. Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Now, dear committee members, I have a raised hand by Ms. Martinez-Ferrada. Yes? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we move on to the budget, I was wondering if I might propose something to my colleagues. Because since we started this sitting, and given that the minister has proposed a reform, and we often mention to it, I would like to propose something to my colleagues, and I hope we will achieve unanimous consent to be able to invite the minister to the committee to be able to ask her questions on the reform she published. So I would like to discuss that with you and with the clerk to determine when on the calendar that could be done. I know we have filled up future meetings, but I think it would behoove us to receive the minister and discuss that reform. Thank you. Duly noted. We only have about 10 minutes with our technical team. Mr. Blaney, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I agree with the budget proposal. If I read it right, it's $4,800. And as for my colleague's proposal, Ms. Martinez-Freda, I think it is an excellent idea. We're at the Official Languages Committee. So even if she doesn't have a bill, I think the minister should be invited so we may ask her questions. And as soon as possible, hopefully table her bill. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'll just have to check with the clerk. Madam Clerk, does that require a motion or a notice of motion? Or can members proceed now to be able to determine when the minister could be slotted in? Mr. Dubourg, the answer to the question is that since the motion was not tabled with 48 hours of notice, unanimous consent from the committee will be required to table it today and to debate it. Very well. Well, let's do that quickly. I don't want to get into a debate. A point of order, Mr. Chair. Yes. Yes, Ms. Martinez. Since I experienced the same thing in another committee, if there is unanimous consent, there is no debate. Mr. Beaulieu, over to you. Turn on your microphone, please. Would there be a timeline? I would like for us to at least be able to begin the study on the situation of French in Quebec, since it has already been delayed. And more information I would give you is that next Thursday, witnesses have been confirmed. So we have French Imperative, QCGN, Senator Joyal, and Eric Labelle, who is a professor. They'll be with us Thursday. And coming back from the break week, we had also prioritized Statistics Canada, and then we will be dealing with the report regarding the study on interpreters on that Thursday, and then another break week.
Given the time, I simply want to ask members if there unanimous consent. At least we can do that. We don't have to table a motion. Do we have unanimous consent to invite Minister Joly, who's responsible for official languages, at the opportune moment? Is there disagreement? I see Mr. Blaney's hand up. All right. So I think there's unanimous consent. So we'll take that under consideration, and I will inform you. Very briefly now, we sent you a request for a budget a few minutes ago for this motion by Mr. Beaulieu on the government's measures to promote French in Quebec and Canada. So it's $4,600 that's requested. You know that's mostly for video conferencing. There's almost nobody who comes physically to the meeting room. So I'm asking for authorization from the members so that I can sign this budget to begin our study on Thursday of this week. Is there any objection from any members for this amount of $4,600? I don't see any. So that's adopted. I will close with Ms. Martinez-Freda. Was that a mistake? Your hand was up. No? Okay. So with that, I want to thank you all and thank the technical team, the clerk, analysts, computer technicians who accompanied us tonight. So it's 8:48. This meeting is adjourned now. Thank you and have a good evening. Good evening.